Once again, this is a bit anatomy at heart. Now, ACM was with my colleague, who's Richard, and so that president has been Solomon. Today, we're talking generally about the skull. This is the skull of the pig, representative of the porcine species. Today, I would like to highlight the general features of the skull, using the skull of the pig as an example. The skull generally is in two halves. You have the upper half and the lower half. The upper half, called the cranium, which has the upper jaw. Lower half, called the mandible, which has the lower jaw. For the time being, we'll be talking about the cranium of the skull. That's the upper half of the skull. The cranium of the skull is in two parts. We have the neurocranium and the splanchnolocranium. The neurocranium refers to the bones that houses the brain, and the splanchnolocranium refers to the facial bones. So, for the time being here, we're talking about the facial bones. That's the bones that makes up the splanchnolocranium. From the frontal dorsal view here, we have the nasal bone. The nasal bone is a paired bone. This represents the suture that separates the pair of nasal bones. This is the caudal end of the nasal bone. The caudal end of the nasal bone joins the frontal bone at this suture. The nasal bone forms the roof of the nasal cavity. This is the incisive bone. The incisive bone is also a paired bone. The incisive bone is also part of the upper jaw. So inside is the nasal cavity. In the nasal cavity are two pairs of turbinate bones, with the upper turbinate bone being the dorsal nasal concha and the lower pair of turbinate bone being the ventral nasal concha. The two pair of turbinate bones helps in filtration of air. From this angle here, we have the maxillary bone. This is the cranial end of the maxillary bone, and this is the caudal end of the maxillary bone. This represents the suture. That's where the cranial end of the maxillary bone joins with the incisive bone. And this is the suture that separates the maxillary bone from the lacrimal bone. And this is a suture that separates the maxillary bone from the zygomatic bone. So, the maxillary bone is the largest bone of the face. The maxillary bone is also the principal bone of the upper jaw. The maxillary bone, together with the incisive bone, forms the upper jaw. On the maxillary bone is an opening. The opening on the maxillary bone is called the infraorbital foramen. This is the lacrimal bone. This is the suture that separates the lacrimal bone from the maxillary bone. And this is the suture that separates the lacrimal bone from the zygomatic bone. On the lacrimal bone is an opening. The opening on the lacrimal bone is called the lacrimal foramen. Lacrimal foramen enters the nasal cavity as the lacrimal canal. This structure here is the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone extends caudally to form a joint with the temporal bone. The zygomatic bone extending caudally forms a curve or an arch. The curve the zygomatic bone extends caudally to form is called the zygomatic arch. This is the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch is made up of two processes, as the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. This is a zygomatic process of the frontal bone. In different species, the zygomatic process of the frontal bone joins with the zygomatic arch to form a complete orbit. But in this species here, the zygomatic process of the frontal bone doesn't join the zygomatic arch to form a complete orbit. Therefore, in this species here, it's an incomplete orbit. This whole socket here is called the orbit. From this angle, we can see there an opening. That is called the maxillary foramen. The maxillary foramen enters the bone and exits as the infraorbital foramen on the maxillary bone as the infraorbital canal. So, from this side here, we have this whole structure here. This whole structure here is called the hard palate. The hard palate forms the roof of the buccal cavity and also forms the base of the nasal cavity. This is the cranial end of the hard palate, and this is the caudal end of the hard palate. The cranial end of the hard palate is called the palatine process of the incisive bone. This part is called the palatine process of the maxillary bone. The caudal part of the hard palate is called the palatine bone. The palatine bone is also a paired bone. On the hard palate are two openings. That's the major palatine foramen and the minor palatine foramen. This is a suture that separates the pair of palatine bones. From here, you can see there are two processes here. Two processes here. This process is part of the palatine bone, and this process here forms the wings of the pterygoid bone. So, talking about the pterygoid bone, this is the pterygoid bone. The pterygoid bone is also a paired bone, and these are the wings of the pterygoid bone. This structure here is called the vomer. The vomer also is a single bone. And we also have the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is the bone that separates the neurocranium from the splanchnoscranium. The ethmoid bone can't be seen unless a transverse section is made before the ethmoid bone can be seen. So, with those parts mentioned are the parts that forms the facial bones, or the part that makes up the splanchnoscranium. Now, talking about the parts that makes up the neurocranium, or the part that houses the brain. From the frontal dorsal view again, we have the frontal bone. This is the frontal bone. This is the cranial end of the frontal bone. This is the caudal end of the frontal bone. The cranial end of the frontal bone joins the nasal bone at this suture, and the caudal end of the frontal bone joins the parietal bones at this suture. This represents a suture that separates the pair of frontal bones. On the frontal bone is an opening. The opening on the frontal bone is called the supraorbital foramen. From here, we have the parietal bones. The parietal bone is also a paired bone. In between the two parietal bones is the interparietal bone. From this angle here, this is the nuchal crest. And downwards here, we have the occipital bone. The occipital bone forms the dorsal part of the neurocranium, and the occipital bone protect the dorsal part of the brain. The occipital bone in different species may be different, but in this species here, it is flat or squamous. These are the occipital condyles. The occipital condyles borders the foramen magnum. This opening here is the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is the part where the brain exits as a spinal cord. We have two processes here. That's the paracondylar processes. Now, from this side here, we have the sphenoid. This is the sphenoid. The sphenoid is a part, or is a bone, where the brain sits. The sphenoid is also in two parts. We have the presphenoid and have the basisphenoid. This is the temporal bone. Temporal bone is also made up of two parts. We have the flat or the squamous part and the petrous or the rocky part. The petrous part of the temporal bone is where the tympanibular is located. On here we can see two openings. This is the hypoglossal foramen, and this is the stylomastoid foramen. The hypoglossal foramen is where the hypoglossal nerves passes through. So that's for the parts of the neurocranium. So the neurocranium and the splenocrinium together forms the cranium of the skull. So the cranium of the skull, that has the upper jaw, that's the upper half of the skull, together with the lower half of the skull, called the mandible, that has the lower jaw. We have the skull generally. So I'll leave it to my colleague to talk about the lower half of the skull, that's the mandible.
This is the mandible. The mandible is the lower half of the skull and also the lower jaw, which holds the lower teeth in position. The mandible is a pair bone made up of two halves and is fused as one along the mandibular symphysis. This is the mandibular symphysis. The mandibular symphysis is a cartilaginous joint and with fibrous cartilage between them. So in this case, it's ossified and is fused as one. We have the mandibular space, that's the space between the two halves of the mandible. So this is the mandibular space. The mandible is divided into two parts. You have the horizontal part and the vertical part. The horizontal part is the body and the vertical part is the ramus. On the body, we have pars molaris, where the molar teeth insert, and also pars incisivus, where the incisors comes to insert. The space between the molar and the incisors, this space is the interalveolar space. Also, the teeth comes to insert in an alveoli and is united by periodontal ligament and is a gum fussis. On the ramus of the mandible, the dorsal end, we have the articulating surface. At the dorsal end, there are two processes. You have the conoid process, and the condylar process. In between the conoid process and the condylar process, there is a groove. This is the mandibular notch. The condylar process articulates with the temporal bone to form the temporomandibular joint. So it articulates with the temporal bone to form the temporomandibular joint. It's a diatrosis, it's a movable joint in the skull. And it's biaxial in function. So biaxial means that it moves in two axes. And helps you to masticate. Moves in two hours. Moves up and down and then sideways. Okay. On the ramus, the lateral side of the ramus, there is a depression. It goes down. There is the masseter fossa, and masseter muscles comes to insect here. Masseter muscles are the powerful muscle for mastication. The body and the ramus comes to join and it forms an angle. Forms an angle. This is the mandibular angle, and on the mandibular angle is the angular process. In this case here, it's not prominent. It's prominent in other species. It's prominent, for example, here. This is the mandible of the dog. You can see the angular process stands out, very prominent in that of the dog. We also have the symphysial surface, where the two halves of the mandible come to meet. That's along the mandibular symphysis. This is the symphysial surface. Then we have the vascular impression. The vascular impression can also be seen here. The vascular impression. On the medial side of the mandible, there is also another depression. There is this other depression. This is the pterygoid fossa, and pterygoid muscles comes to insect here. This opening is the mandibular foramen. It goes through the bone and exits at the mental foramen. Here the mental foramina, there are numerous mental foramina. Exits at the mental foramina to form the mandibular canal. So the mandibular canal starts from the mandibular foramen and ends at the mental foramen, through which nerves, arteries, and veins passes through. We also have the lambuli. It's at the edge of the mandibular foramen. Stands out like a bone. It's a lambuli. It's prominent in other species. There is also a groove. Here known as the mylohyoid groove, and mylohyoid comes to insect here. Mylohyoid muscles comes to insect here. So this is the mandible and the lower jaw, to be specific, and I will leave it to my colleague Moses to finish.
So this is the lower half of the skull, called the mandible, which has the lower jaw. This is the upper half of the skull, called the cranium, which has the upper jaw. When the upper half of the skull and the lower half joins together, they form the skull. And this is the skull of the pig, a representative of the porcine species. Once again, this is Vet Anatomy at Heart. Thanks to our lecturer, Dr. Tony Okubajiman, and our president, Aspirin Solomon. See you in our next video. And in our next video, we're talking about the various canals, foramens, and fosses. Thank you very much for watching us. Bye bye. Please subscribe, like, and share our channel. Thank you very much.